If you've enjoyed this story of standing up against injustice, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling tale. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface. Let us know in the comments how you would have handled a situation like this. We love hearing from you. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a fiery glow across the neatly trimmed lawns of the neighborhood. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of lawnmowers. As Tom pulled into his driveway after another long day at work, he stopped dead in his tracks. His heart sank when he saw it. The cars, dozens of them, strewn across his yard, blocking the very access road he had always known was his and his alone. It was a sight he had never imagined. The once pristine lawn was now a maze of vehicles with no consideration for the person who actually owned the land beneath them. Tom took a deep breath, trying to steady the anger that rose like a tide within him. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had never been a confrontational person. He preferred to live quietly in his home. But this was too much. The audacity of it all. He could feel his blood pressure rise as he stepped out of the car and onto the gravel driveway. The smell of gasoline hit him next as the cars remained unmoved, as though the owners had no regard for the space they occupied. He scanned the vehicles. There was no doubt. All of them belonged to members of the HOA, the homeowners association that had long since taken it upon themselves to impose petty rules and regulations on everyone in the neighborhood. Tom had learned to tolerate them. He had always paid his dues and kept his lawn pristine in compliance with their constant oversight. But this was a clear invasion. He had never been told about any parking restrictions or events taking place. That would require this kind of intrusion. The HOA had always played nice with him. Until now. Tom clenched his jaw and marched toward the front door of his house, determined to do something about this madness. The only problem was he wasn't sure where to begin. He knew one thing for sure, though. He wasn't going to let this slide. A few minutes later, he stood at the entrance to Mrs. Carson's house, the HOA president. Her home was the largest in the neighborhood. She liked to remind everyone of that fact every chance she got. Her property was immaculate with perfectly manicured bushes and an expansive front lawn that seemed to scream for attention. It was the kind of house that made Tom feel small in comparison. And she knew it. Mrs. Carson was standing at the front door when Tom approached her. She smiled, that smug smile of hers, as though she already knew what was coming. "Tom, how nice to see you," she said in that overly sweet voice that sent a chill down his spine. "I need to talk to you about the cars." Tom said, his voice betraying his frustration. "They're parked all over my yard." Mrs. Carson's smile didn't falter. Instead, she raised an eyebrow. "Oh, that. Don't worry, Tom. It's just for the community picnic we're hosting today. Everyone will be leaving soon." Tom tried to keep his voice steady. "I don't care if it's for a picnic. This is private property. You can't just park here without asking me first." Mrs. Carson's expression shifted slightly, but not enough to show any real concern. "Oh, Tom, you're always so serious. It's just a few cars. Surely you can spare your yard for a little while. We're all part of the same community." Her words dripped with condescension, as though his concerns were nothing more than an inconvenience. Tom could feel his patience fraying at the edges. He had always been the easygoing neighbor, the one who went along to get along. But this was different. "I don't care about your community picnic," he said, his voice now a low growl. "You've been using my property without permission, and that needs to stop." Mrs. Carson's smile faded for a split second before she regained her composure. "I don't think you understand how these things work," she said in a tone that suggested she was humoring him. "We're all in this together, and frankly, your little complaints are starting to sound a bit petty." Tom's face flushed with anger. He had reached the limit of his patience. "Petty," he repeated quietly, as though the word itself was too ridiculous to even understand. "I'm not asking you for permission. I'm telling you to move these cars off my yard." Mrs. Carson's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained calm. "Well, Tom, I'm afraid you'll just have to deal with it. We've got a lot of people here, and I'm sure the cars won't be in your yard much longer." That was it, the final straw. Tom felt his blood boiling as she turned away to speak to one of the other neighbors. His thoughts raced. What was he supposed to do? How could she just dismiss him like that? He had always been a good neighbor, never complained about the trivialities that everyone else seemed to care about. But this was different. He turned and walked back to his house, his mind reeling. How could he let this go? It wasn't just about the cars. It was about respect. It was about boundaries. And Mrs. Carson had crossed a line. As he stood on his porch looking out at the mess, he realized something. He had always been so focused on being the good guy playing by the rules. But now the rules didn't matter. What mattered was getting his property back. He was done being the passive one. He wasn't going to let the HOA walk all over him anymore. Tom took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He wasn't going to back down. He would find a way to fix this, he had to. The day had already begun to fade into evening, but for Tom it was just the beginning. He wasn't sure how he would do it or what it would take, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Mrs. Carson get away with this. He owned that road, and no one was going to take that away from him. As the last of the cars began to leave the parking lot, Tom stood there waiting. This was just the start of something much bigger, and he was ready to take the next step. Tom spent the next few days simmering with frustration. The sight of his yard still haunted him. Mrs. Carson's words echoed in his mind, and every time he saw the cars parked on his private property, a fire lit in his chest. He had been patient for far too long. The HOA had overstepped their bounds, and now they would pay the price. But how? The answers didn't come immediately. Tom was a man of routine, not a schemer or a planner. He had never been one to fight back in this way. But there was something about this injustice that gnawed at him. He had always been quiet, the guy who smiled and nodded, who followed the rules even when it felt wrong. But Mrs. Carson had pushed him too far. Tom sat at his kitchen table, papers scattered around him. He had gone online and researched property laws, HOA regulations, anything that might give him a foothold. The more he read, the more the realization settled in. He owned the only access road to the neighborhood. It was his. No one else had the legal right to park on it or use it without his permission. But the HOA didn't care about that. They had done whatever they wanted for years and assumed Tom would just take it. But no more. The next day he set out to gather more information. He spoke with a few of the neighbors, people who had been affected by the HOA's actions, but were too afraid to speak up. As he talked with them, he saw a common thread. They were all fed up with Mrs. Carson and the way she wielded her power. Some were afraid of the retaliation, others just didn't want to get involved. But Tom wasn't going to let fear hold him back anymore. One neighbor, George, a retired lawyer, seemed particularly interested in helping Tom. He had always kept to himself, but when Tom mentioned his research, George's eyes lit up. "You've got a case here, Tom," he said as they sat in his living room. "The HOA can't just trample over your rights. They've been doing it because no one's ever had the guts to fight back." Tom leaned forward, eager to hear more. "What should I do? How do I make them listen?" George smiled, the kind of smile that meant he was about to share something important. "We'll start with the basics, document everything. Every time they park on your property, every interaction with Mrs. Carson. Get video footage if you can. And start making it public. That's the key. Visibility." The idea of going public sent a chill through Tom. He had never been one to seek attention. The thought of everyone in the neighborhood knowing about his problems made him uneasy. But George was right. If he wanted to make a real difference, he had to expose the HOA's wrongdoing for all to see. "Once you've got your evidence," George continued, "we'll send a formal letter to the HOA board. We'll make sure they know we mean business, and if they don't respond, well, then we take it further. This isn't just about your property anymore, it's about holding them accountable." Tom felt a surge of determination. He had a plan now, a real one. He wasn't going to let Mrs. Carson continue to get away with treating him like a doormat. Over the next few weeks, Tom kept his head down, gathering evidence. He made note of the times the HOA cars parked on his property and took photos. He even set up a small camera in his yard to capture footage of the cars coming and going. It wasn't easy, and the process felt tedious, but every time he reviewed the footage, his resolve strengthened. He didn't realize how deep the problem ran until he attended the next HOA meeting. Tom had never gone to one before, never felt the need to get involved. But now he had a purpose. He wanted to see how the HOA operated, to hear what Mrs. Carson and the others had to say for themselves. The meeting was held in the community center, a building that was more glamorous than it had any right to be. Tom slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. He watched as Mrs. Carson presided over the meeting, her voice carrying with an air of authority that made people lean in. Tom clenched his fists. How had he let someone like her walk all over him for so long? As the meeting wore on, Mrs. Carson started talking about community improvements. She was boasting about new rules she had implemented, all designed to make the neighborhood better. Rules that favored the HOA's control over every aspect of their residents' lives. Tom sat there, feeling his blood boil. He knew that every word she said was another lie. At one point, she turned her attention to Tom. "Is there something you'd like to add, Tom?" she asked with that fake sweetness, clearly trying to humiliate him in front of the others. Tom stood up, his heart pounding. The room went silent as all eyes turned toward him. He felt his stomach twist with anxiety, but he pushed it down. He wasn't here to be afraid anymore. "I'd like to discuss the issue of parking on my property," Tom said, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've noticed that cars belonging to HOA members have been parking on my yard without my permission." A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Carson's face tightened, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Oh, Tom," she said sweetly, "we've already talked about this. It's just for a short time during community events. I'm sure you can spare your yard for a few hours." But Tom wasn't backing down. "It's not just a few hours, Mrs. Carson. It's every time you have an event. And this isn't just about parking, it's about respect. My yard is my property, and I won't allow it to be used without my consent." The room went quiet. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Carson's smile faltered for a moment before she regained her composure. "Tom, I think you're overreacting. We're all part of this community. There's no need to make a scene." But Tom saw the cracks in her armor. The more she spoke, the more he could see her true nature. She was losing control. And that was the first victory he needed. When the meeting ended, Tom didn't leave with his tail between his legs. He left with a fire burning inside him. He had made his stand. Now he would make sure Mrs. Carson and the HOA felt the consequences. He stepped out into the cool evening air. Tom knew this was only the beginning. He had a plan. And it was going to work. The next few days were a blur for Tom. His focus was razor sharp as he meticulously compiled his evidence. Every photograph, every video clip added weight to his case. It wasn't just about the parking anymore. It was about showing everyone the truth about the HOA and how they had treated him like an afterthought for years. He couldn't back down now. Tom knew he needed to take the next step. Mrs. Carson was not going to back off easily, and neither was the HOA. But he had something they didn't expect, a plan. He decided to start small but make a big impact. He began to research local news outlets and social media platforms. What he found was eye-opening. The more he dug, the more he saw that others had suffered at the hands of the HOA's overreach. Stories of bizarre fines for trivial offenses, neighbors complaining about ridiculous rules that seemed designed to squeeze every penny out of the residents. Tom wasn't alone in his frustration. He began to reach out to people who had been affected by the HOA's demands. He spoke to people in the neighborhood who were fed up but too afraid to take action. Slowly but surely, Tom built a network of people willing to stand up to Mrs. Carson and the HOA. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all of them. It wasn't long before Tom received a call from George, the retired lawyer. Tom, we've got to move quickly, George said, his voice urgent. I've been talking to some of the neighbors. They're ready to take this public, but we need to make sure we have all our ducks in a row first. Tom's heart raced. What do we do next? We send a letter to the HOA board. George replied. Make sure they know we mean business. But we don't. Just send it quietly. We make sure the media knows. We get the story out there. Once the public gets wind of this, they'll start asking questions. That's when Mrs. Carson and her cronies will have no choice but to back down. The idea of going public still made Tom nervous. He wasn't someone who liked being the center of attention. But this was bigger than his personal discomfort. This was about justice, and he wasn't going to let fear stop him. Tom sat down at his kitchen table and drafted the letter with George's help. They made sure every detail was clear and concise. The evidence was irrefutable. The letter outlined the unauthorized parking on Tom's property, the repeated violations, and the HOA's refusal to acknowledge or correct their actions. When it was ready, Tom took a deep breath and hit send. He sent the letter to the HOA board and copied several local media outlets. He knew this was a dangerous move. Mrs. Carson wouldn't let this slide easily, but it was the only way to ensure she couldn't ignore him anymore. The next morning, Tom was already up and pacing. He had barely slept the night before. The weight of his decision hung over him like a dark cloud. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He had crossed a line. As he walked to his car to head to work, he checked his phone. His inbox was flooded with notifications. The letter had gone live. Local news outlets had picked it up, and the story was spreading like wildfire. Tom's heart pounded as he scrolled through the articles. The HOA's dirty laundry was out in the open for everyone to see. The truth was no longer buried beneath their lies and power. But then came the call. Mrs. Carson. Tom. Her voice was icy cold, devoid of the fake sweetness she usually used. What do you think you're doing? Tom stood tall, even though he could feel the weight of the confrontation pressing down on him. I'm doing what should have been done. Years ago, he said, his voice steady. I'm standing up for myself and for the other people you've bullied. She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made his skin crawl. You think you've won, don't you? She said with a sneer. You think this little stunt will scare me? I don't need to scare you, Tom replied. I just need to make sure everyone knows who you really are. The line went silent for a moment, and Tom could almost feel Mrs. Carson seething on the other end. You've made a mistake, Tom. She finally said, her voice thick with venom. This will not end well for you. Tom hung up without saying another word. He had done what he needed to do. Now, it was out of his hands. The next few days were tense. Tom kept his eyes on the news articles on social media. The story was everywhere now. People were sharing their own HOA horror stories and calling out Mrs. Carson for her underhanded tactics. The pressure was mounting, and Tom could see that Mrs. Carson was cracking. Then came the phone call. It was the HOA board. They wanted to meet. Tom wasn't sure whether to feel triumphant or nervous. The invitation to meet with the board was a sign that they were beginning to realize they couldn't ignore him. But it also meant that Mrs. Carson was pulling out all the stops to protect herself. Tom arrived at the meeting with George by his side. As he stepped into the conference room, he saw the faces of the HOA board members. They were all business, suits and stone-cold expressions. But Tom could see the tension in their eyes. They knew they were in trouble. Mrs. Carson was seated at the head of the table, her eyes locked with Tom's as he took a seat across from her. The silence between them was thick with unspoken animosity. Tom. She began, her voice, forced but controlled. I think we can settle this matter without going any further. Tom didn't trust her words. He had heard the same sweet promises before. I'm listening, he said, his tone firm. We're willing to offer a solution. Mrs. Carson continued, her smile faltering only slightly. We'll pay for any damage done to your property, and we'll make sure it never happens again. But Tom wasn't buying it. I'm not here for money, he said, his voice sharp. I'm here for accountability. And I'm not leaving this table until you and the rest of the board understand that. The tension in the room was palpable as Tom laid out his demands. He wanted a formal apology from Mrs. Carson, a guarantee that the HOA would never again use his property without his permission, and most importantly, he wanted the public to know the truth about how the HOA had abused its power. By the time the meeting ended, Mrs. Carson was livid. She had tried to control the situation, but Tom wasn't backing down. He had made his point clear. As he walked out of the room, Tom knew this wasn't over, but he also knew that the tables were turning. The HOA was on the defensive, and they knew it. Tom had just started to see the fruits of his labor, and it felt good. The days that followed the meeting felt like a ticking clock. Tom knew he was on the verge of something big, but he could feel the storm brewing. Mrs. Carson was not the type to lose gracefully. She had always been a woman who thrived on control and power, and now for the first time she was losing both. Tom kept his head down, making sure he stayed under the radar while his legal strategy gained momentum. He had sent out press releases, contacted more media outlets, and even started a petition. The news was spreading faster than he expected. The HOA's reputation was tarnished, their lies laid bare for all to see. But Mrs. Carson wasn't taking this lying down. In fact, she was doubling down. She had called an emergency HOA meeting, one that was private and unannounced to the public. Tom had been expecting this, but it still sent a chill through him when he got the invitation. This meeting wasn't about reconciliation. It was about retaliation. Tom arrived at the community center, his mind sharp, his resolve steady. He had come this far. He wasn't about to back down now. As he walked into the room, he saw the familiar faces of the HOA board members, their stern expressions telling him everything he needed to know. They were ready to fight, and they had Mrs. Carson leading the charge. "Tom," she said when he stepped, in her voice laced with thinly veiled venom, "you've made a mistake. You've embarrassed this community, and now you will pay the price." Tom didn't flinch. "I'm not here to apologize," he said, his tone cold, but clear. "I'm here to make sure you understand the cost of abusing your power." Mrs. Carson's eyes narrowed. "You think you've won," she sneered, "but you're just a pawn in this. You're nothing more than a distraction to what we're really doing here." Tom felt a flicker of doubt, but he quickly dismissed it. He knew he was in the right. He had the evidence, the support, and the public behind him. The tables had already turned. "We're going to make this right," Mrs. Carson said, standing up and moving toward him. "But not in the way you think. We'll make sure your little story dies right here. We'll have the media on our side, we'll call in favors, and we'll bury you." The air grew thick with tension. Tom could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, but he wasn't intimidated. He had come too far to let her scare him now. "You think you can just sweep this under the rug?" he said, his voice unwavering. "You're wrong. I've exposed you for who you are. You can't control the narrative anymore. Not this time." Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from George. "The news is covering the meeting," it read. "It's already gone live. You've got them cornered." A sense of calm washed over Tom. He wasn't alone in this fight. The public had already rallied around him, and now the world was watching. Mrs. Carson's face twisted in rage. She stepped back, glaring at him. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Tom. I'm going to make sure you regret this. I will ruin you." But Tom stood his ground, feeling the surge of victory rise within him. He knew that the real power was in the truth, and the truth had already won. Just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the meeting room opened. A reporter from a local news outlet walked in, phone in hand, ready to document the chaos. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm but firm, "but I'm here to cover this meeting. There have been numerous reports about the HOA's actions, and we've been asked to investigate." The board members froze. Mrs. Carson's expression faltered, and for the first time, Tom saw fear flicker in her eyes. The media was here. The game had changed. "We can't do this anymore," the reporter continued. "Not with the way things are going. The public's already up in arms. People are demanding answers." Tom couldn't help but smile. It was happening. The walls were closing in on Mrs. Carson and her cronies. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated the power of the people. Mrs. Carson tried to regain control, but the cracks in her facade were too wide. "This is an internal matter," she snapped, her voice losing its previous authority. "We're not obligated to answer to anyone." But the reporter stood her ground. "You're wrong. You're obligated to the public. You're obligated to transparency. And right now that's exactly what the people want." The board members looked uneasy. Tom could see them shift in their seats, their resolve wavering. Mrs. Carson's once imposing presence had faded. She was no longer the woman who had controlled everything. "This isn't over," Mrs. Carson hissed, her face twisted with fury. "I will take you down, Tom. You'll regret ever stepping foot in this room." Tom's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained calm. "You've already lost, Mrs. Carson. The people know the truth now, and there's nothing you can do to change that." The reporter nodded and began taking notes. The tension in the room dissipated as the realization hit everyone present. Tom had won. It was over. As the meeting came to a close, Tom stood up, his back straight, his confidence unshaken. He had fought back, not with force, but with strategy. And in the end, it had paid off. He walked out of the room with his head held high, knowing that Mrs. Carson's reign of terror was finally over. The media would be relentless, the public outraged. And Tom? He was just getting started. The victory was sweet, but Tom knew this was only the beginning. The HOA had learned the hard way that no one could be above the law, especially when someone was willing to stand up and fight. The story would spread, the justice would be served, and Mrs. Carson's reputation would crumble piece by piece until there was nothing left but the truth. And Tom, he had the last laugh.